best student by a long way that we had for the whole year, and he was talking about this university, and it's great to see it. You're pretty lucky to have such a nice facility, and it's a beautiful environment as well. It's a really nice place to be. I graduated from Melbourne Uni back in 1989. I'm going to talk today, not so much about horse rescue as such, but I guess some animal welfare and injury characteristics of bushfire in Australia, because there's hardly anything in the literature that we found when these bushfires hit down our way. We scrambled for the internet and the literature, and there's very little information on how horses respond to bushfire, injuries, etc., and management. So we learned an awful lot from this. On February the 7th, that was a Saturday, I was working that day and the day before, and they were, if anyone remembers, they were horrendous days. We had 46 degrees, we had 100 k plus winds, tin to dry everywhere. It was actually terrifying, even before the fire. It was really unsettling conditions. And unfortunately, these conditions are likely to be getting more frequent for us in years to come. And there'd been warnings all that week from the Bureau of Meteorology and from government authorities and so forth that this Saturday, the 7th, was going to be the worst bushfire risk day in history. And where I live or work, which is just on the edge of this bushfire area, is our practice, and we serve sort of mainly horses and also cattle in this sort of district here. People are actually very bushfire aware. It's a real hotspot for bushfires, and people had the warning, and there was a lot of criticism in the media afterwards that people weren't proactive enough and didn't react. But I know a lot of people were ready, they thought they were ready, and they tried to react. But as everyone knows, it's difficult moving stock, number one, and it's difficult moving yourselves, number two, particularly when you have one road in, one road out of a lot of these places. And I don't know what New South Wales is like, but I presume where a lot of these fires are, it's exactly the same at the moment. So people were caught out, and I had nurses and friends on the phone to me sort of through that Saturday, surrounded by fire, an hour or two before the media was announcing where the fire was. And that's how fast this thing was moving. It was moving, there were 35 kilometre spots, ahead of the main front. It was moving at more than a kilometre a minute. And the radiant heat, not just the flames, were horrendous, as they are with all bushfires. And there's reports of animals and people being killed sort of up to 400 metres or more away. So despite apparent preparedness and warning, 173 people died directly in those fires, and 2,100 houses or homes were destroyed through these red areas here that we can see largely, particularly on the Saturday and also the Sunday. And on the Sunday, a wind change came through, which actually just turned the fire around, and even though it cooled things down a bit and caused a bit more carnage. I'm going to talk sort of largely about the constraints of what should have been an effective animal welfare response at that time, and also some behavioural and injury-related observations that we made and what we learnt from it. The reality was, and unfortunately I think it still is to a large degree, is that animal welfare considerations really aren't part of big management plans. It's okay at small levels where we have sort of our rescue groups and rescue organisations and so forth, but as soon as you get a state disaster and you have the government stepping in, they unfortunately don't have much, I shouldn't say regard, but certainly there's not much planning for an animal welfare response, and that caused all sorts of problems for us. 4:30 that day was my first phone call from a client that had driven out of the fire zone with her dog that had some burnt pads and was having trouble breathing, and she was in quite a state, and she also wanted some medications to take back for one of her horses that had suffered some fairly minor burns. So that was my first attendance at the fire zone, which was at St Andrews here. And the first thing I came across was probably the biggest constraint that we had to mounting an effective response to the police roadblocks. Now, of course, there have to be police roadblocks for a few reasons: to protect people from their own stupidity, to protect from looting, and unfortunately, as soon as there's a death in a fire zone, it becomes a crime scene. As soon as it's a crime scene, there's a real lockdown and there's a real difficulty for anyone obtaining access, even property owners, to that particular area. But it became a bit of a nightmare because no one kind of ever knew who had authority of who to let through and who not. So basically no one was allowed through. And there was arguments and frustrations and so forth constantly in that first week to 2 weeks at these roadblocks from us, from veterinarians, from animal owners, from homeowners, etc. A big frustration, in particular from our point of view, is the media were allowed in on pretty much straight away. They were jumping in on CFA trucks. Media were getting in there. And council officers were getting in there, which theoretically was great, that rangers were getting in there to euthanase animals that needed euthanasing. But a problem with that is they do a great job, but they're not trained and able to assess whether a horse needs to be euthanased or not. There was a lot of horses that were euthanased that we believe didn't need to be euthanased because veterinarians were not allowed into these fire zones. We got in parts, we sort of went through back roads and sort of occasionally just drove through a roadblock when there was an emergency, but you could only, that was restricted, and there was only so much that we could do. But it was really frustrating that media were there and council were in there for probably 3 days before we were able to get in to any effective way at all. Eventually, after about a week, they had this accreditation scheme where you could accredit yourself as a person that was allowed entry into certain areas here to go and treat, but that took a whole week for that process to happen. And by then, most of the emergency response in regard to animals had finished. The other constraint to an effective response was just a lack of coordination between all of the authorities, which was no individual authority's fault. It was just, I guess, a lack of foreplanning from pretty much all of them. DPI essentially had the responsibility to mount an emergency response in regard to animal welfare for large animals. They delegated the responsibility, and this was ridiculous, of some horses, as in pleasure horses in particular, to the RSPCA. So the DPI had authority over thoroughbred breeding farms, but pretty much all other horses were delegated to the responsibility of the RSPCA. Now the RSPCA, in theory, they had a management plan. I don't know if they did. I don't think they did. I still don't think they do in regard to horses. I'm not talking about wildlife and small animals, but the horses that they had the delegated responsibility, they were pretty much ineffective, and that's partly because they're an undermanned organisation as well. DSC did a good job in regard to wildlife in conjunction with the RSPCA, but there was this lack of coordination between these groups and us, unable to get any answers, no matter who we rang, whether we rang these guys, DPI, DSC, the AVA, no one knew who was meant to be in charge to coordinate an effective response. And as a result, the only real response came from all the local combination of local volunteers, local veterinarians and various rescue groups, including Project Hope and Triple R Equine were probably the two main ones in our area. And it wasn't until probably 3 weeks later, maybe 2.5 to 3 weeks later, that we finally got some assistance from the Australian Veterinary Association and also from the RSPCA, because we were sort of attending largely horses at that point in time. And that assistance was financial assistance rather than any logistical assistance. So we as a veterinary practice, apart from treating animals, which we had everyone on deck constantly for about 4 weeks, was also managing this crazy, massive volume of truckloads of donated blankets and dog food from Western Australia, from Queensland. No one knew who to ring. So they rang the vet clinics near the area. And so there was a massive amount of effort put in from the clinics just to coordinate the donations, and also the volunteers, vets from all around the place, and other volunteers would ring the vet clinics and say, can I help? So, we'd have this list of 100 people that you're trying to coordinate as well. So it was a real frustrating period. I've got council and media here. Media were sort of a constraint in that they kind of generally didn't seem to take animal welfare seriously. The media's going constantly 24/7. We had 2 stations going there, an ABC station and a commercial station, constantly on bushfire stuff, and you had to fight really hard to get onto a radio program to give some advice or some direction, because there was a lot of confusion out there. So media, in general, were frustrating to get involved in it. Council did a good job with what they did. As I said, council rangers were allowed in very early, but unfortunately they couldn't bring veterinarians with them on these CFA trucks, and everything suffered as a result. So they were the main constraints. And then, of course, there was a bushfire commission, and you would hope that some changes have come out of that, but I'll talk about that soon. So how do horses generally cope with bushfire? Well, we didn't know, and there was nothing in the literature that we could find, but of course we learned a lot from the process. Not horses, of course, still large animals, and they basically horses cope really well. Horses, more so than cattle, obviously we all know, have a much greater flight response and a greater flight and fright response. And they don't think very much about things. They don't think ahead, which is kind of good, I think. They just reacted to the situation as it was. They ran away from flames. If they got to a barrier, they would jump across the flames into burnt grass, burnt pasture. And yes, they get burnt feet and so forth. But horses generally did very, very, very well. In our area, no one knows for sure, but it's estimated, in Victoria, it's estimated low hundreds, 200 to 300 horses died. There's widely varying estimations. I know there was one DPI estimate of 130. But yeah, we think we're in the sort of low hundreds. I saw Naomi was here before. She might have some more idea than that. Yeah. Thousands of cattle and sheep and many, many thousands of wildlife. But horses cope very, very well with bushfire. All the literature sort of search that we did was largely based on stable fires, largely in the United States. And initially we thought that's what we'd be following, but no, things were very, very different. So I'll just go through some of the health impacts that we saw. Pulmonary or lung impacts. Smoke inhalation didn't seem to be a major thing, but certainly thermal burns of the lungs was a big thing. And it's hard to differentiate between smoke inhalation and thermal damage, but essentially a lot of the effects are the same. So we saw a lot of horses with little coughs. We got the odd horse with bad infections, but it basically wasn't a major problem. Ophthalmic, eye problems, a lot of radiant heat damage to the corneas, a lot of superficial ulceration of eyes, quite a few cases of mild uveitis. But again, apart from a bit of long-term scarring with some of these eyes that we were looking at, an excellent recovery rate in general from both of those. Renal failure, kidneys, surprisingly little. We had a couple, and there was a really poor correlation between the severity of burns and dehydration and non-steroidal anti-inflammatories that we used and the amount of renal disease that we saw. In other words, some of the more minor cases, and this was actually a pretty minor case even though he looks all bandaged up, developed renal failure really severely, whereas a lot of the really bad cases didn't. So there was poor correlation. So I guess we always need to keep in mind renal damage and therefore hydration, early hydration, and careful judicious use of non-steroidal anti-inflammatories and corticosteroids to help reduce it. But you don't see a whole lot of it, or we didn't see a whole lot of it. Laminitis, of course, we saw a heap of, not founder or toxic related laminitis. This was all thermal damage to the laminae. We didn't see horses, pedal bones dropping through the bottom. We didn't see any. Our practice treated about 150 horses. We saw more, but the ones we treated were about 150, and most of those had some degree of burns to their feet. And we didn't see any horse where the pedal bones had rotated and gone through the foot, and that's what we were expecting. The laminitis was mild and quite manageable in general. Probably in regard to laminitis and sort of more related to burns from direct and radiant heat, you can see sort of here coronary band damage was a major thing, where coronets initially might have looked just a bit swollen, but over the next 2 weeks the coronets dropped off and we had deep coronet wounds. And of course then the thinking is the hooves are going to fall off and these horses need to be destroyed. And a lot of horses that were destroyed earlier on by rangers unfortunately had damage here, and the inference was that those horses were not going to be any good because they won't be able to walk again. Well, we didn't have to euthanize any horse from hoof wall damage. We had horses that were hoof walls that were sort of loose and squelching. Their feet were squelching in their hoof walls. They grew a new hoof wall and they were fine. So that was a real surprise to us. We thought that would be a bigger issue than what it was. Dehydration, of course, horses come in dehydrated because of the heat and they hadn't drunk and so forth. So the first thing, again, this is related to reducing your renal disease, your renal failure as well, is hydration. But you know, you don't have time to put every horse on intravenous fluids, and not to mention the costs involved in that. Oral fluids, just oral fluids, every few hours, 5, 6, 7, 8 litres per horse with balanced electrolytes worked marvellously most of the time. And we didn't have to use intravenous fluids on many horses at all. And the ones that we did use it on tend to be horses that we had on constant rate infusion of pain relief, etc. Okay, burns. There were direct burns, of course, and there was radiant heat burns. And when we see the horse, it's pretty hard to tell what was what. But most of these things, and leg wounds and perineal sort of burns are, sorry, not the perineal burns, but a lot of these other ones were presumably from indirect radiant heat. Tails caught fire, and so we saw almost every horse had burns around its perineum, and you can see this flicking of the tail here, caused sort of relatively minor burns along the body. So most of the damage that we saw from burns, we presume, was from radiant heat. Now, I just mentioned pain, that's sort of associated with all of these. Pain relief, burns are incredibly painful, as anyone knows. Most responded well to topical treatments, you know, all the common sense sort of stuff that you normally do for burns, and normal non-steroidal drugs or corticosteroids in some cases. But there were some horses that were in a lot of pain, and these were horses that had severe, worse than third-degree burns where whole muscles were sloughing off and joints were being exposed. And those horses, they're some of the horses that we'd have on intravenous fluids so that we could keep them on ketamine drips and so forth. Overall, horses responded well to treatment and recovered very, very, very well. Just a few pictures here. Coronet wounds. These, I think, by looking at them, were probably taken about a week after the original fire, where the skin has sloughed off, the coronets have gone, and you've got lots of oozing of granulation tissue here. Cattle the same, and again, there was one cow I put down because it was in just too much pain, I thought, but most of the cows that had separation of coronets and loose coronets did well. This was a couple of weeks later, and this is where we can see a new hoof wall starting to grow up the top here, and sort of healing of all of these burns. But as you can see, with the healing you get lots of scarring, which kind of, apart from the cosmetics, didn't cause a problem, except in the eyes. I had a photo, I forgot to put it in, of this horse about a month later, because what had happened is that the scar contraction around the eyelids means that the eyelids contracted and the poor horse couldn't see out through its eyelids anymore. So there was a couple of horses where we had to do relatively straightforward sort of, not cosmetic, reconstructive surgery of eyelids so that they could see through their eyeballs again. This was typical. Virtually all horses had burns around the face, and we presume it's because they're down, wondering what's happening below them, or they're trying to pick or whatever, and you're getting radiant heat burns, in that typical pattern that we saw. Perineal wounds we saw before. Of course, teat wounds in cattle were very, very common, and the main problem with these ones was that the teat canals are often permanently damaged, so mastitis issues down the track. But we didn't get a lot of follow-up really sort of years down the track to know how big that was, because most farmers with cows with severe teat damage would have those euthanized or off to the markets. Okay, just a bit of light relief after all those horrible pictures. Has anyone been to, this is Thorong La Pass in Nepal? Anyone been here? It's the most magnificent place. And you get up there in the Himalayas, we're at 5,400 metres. That's my daughter and me just last year, and just an unbelievable place. The scale of the place is just amazing. Okay, what did we learn from the fires? Well, we learnt that horses cope well and they heal well. We know that anyway. Horses heal well. They hurt themselves bad, but they heal well. So we know that, and they certainly did that with bushfires. This is just a picture of, I don't know, it might be that same horse or a brother of that horse we had before that was on a ketamine infusion. He was in a pretty bad way, and after about 5 weeks developed horrible sloughing of muscles and down to exposed joints, etc. The reactive flight response of horses does seem to be protective. The fact that they are so reactive did seem to help them cope very well in a bushfire. Horses left in large paddocks with low pasture and vegetation cope best. Now that's common sense, that's what you would expect, and that's certainly what we observed in the horse population. Horses that were in forested areas, of course, didn't cope so well unless they were able to just have a bit of luck on their side and break through a fence and get to the right spot. Nothing particularly difficult about treating the burns. It's just basic principles of wound management. It's all lots of nursing care, infection control, and you get excellent results. So first principles and common sense. We did lots of searching in the first couple of days. What do we need to know? What do we need to know? There was nothing you could really read about. But when you think about it, like a lot of what we do, it's just common sense, and horses did very well. Even with really extensive full thickness burns, those secondary infects were pretty uncommon, and horses that we'd see initially when we thought, oh, this poor horse is not going to make it, that they kept on surprising us how well they did. And this is a big one. The ultimate severity of the burns, and it's probably expected really, but it's really unpredictable. You see the horse initially might have a bit of swelling and you think it's going to be okay. 3 days later they're oozing everywhere, and 2 weeks later they can have sort of massive skin and muscle sloughs. So you just don't know what's going to happen until that time elapses. So you've got to be on the ball with them. In other words, don't just say that horse is fine, let it go. They do have to be monitored pretty well. Severe coronary band damage is generally reversible, which is probably the best thing that we learnt out of this. And compared with stable fires, respiratory effects are relatively minimal. Long-term behavioural impacts. There's a lot of horses clients of ours that went through the fires. I can only think of one client that says her horse has changed its temperament for the worse, more flighty, more reactive than what it ever was. I treat with a grain of salt what she says. I'm not sure whether it actually did have an effect on that horse. Maybe it did, but certainly that was the only horse out of a lot that seemed that the owner has commented has caused permanent sort of behavioural impacts. Recommendations to the regulators. We got it, sorry, I nearly finished, involved with the bushfire committee afterwards and put together a paper, a few of the practices around. But basically it came back to animal welfare should become a priority in these large-scale management plans, which is obvious, but it wasn't there. The reason I put this in, I think, obviously every state's different, but when, if you get the opportunity, find out what the management plan says in the state that you're in, and see if you can have some sort of input. Don't wait till the next big fire happens and then have the same problems that we had. Try to get in there and be a bit proactive and influence government decision making and management plans. It's like banging your head against a wall, of course, but it's no reason not to try. So coordinated animal welfare response must be a principal part of emergency responses, and it's not in Victoria. A veterinarian experience with that species should be present, of course, before any animal is destroyed. Now, that's not always going to be practical, but it's something that we should aim for because, there's plenty of animals that will survive that owners and council officers and so forth didn't think would. I said DPI be responsible, but basically there should be one responsible authority for a large animal emergency response, cattle, horses, sheep, etc., because there's lots of things that cross over as far as providing feed and so forth. So rather than delegating it out and have different authorities responsible for different parts, there should be one authority responsible, and they should have a robust management plan. Along the same lines, that there needs to be veterinary input, there needs to be input from the CFA, from the SES, from all of the different groups need to sort of have some sort of input into these plans. That's sort of stating the obvious. When a natural disaster happens in your area, everyone wants to help, so you should use that help. There's a lot of very, very good resources within the local communities rather than, it's good to bring outside people in, but the local community has a real vested interest and an emotional interest, and they'll do a great job, as we found. A single point of contact for everyone to go to get information, because there was mass confusion. No one knew who to ring to get information, where to get emergency supplies, etc. And I think that's important. We had a lot of trouble with that, getting the radio to be of assistance. So what's changed, and are we better off? This was basically in the report coming out of the committee, and they acknowledged that there were big holes in the animal welfare, or pretty much non-existent animal welfare responses, and this was just the start of a recommendation that basically gave an example how the Commission recognised the problem and advised changes. So are we better off? Well, in 2013 we had bushfires in Victoria, in Gippsland, Aberfeldy, and the veterinarians were saying exactly the same things that we said: access, coordination of responses. So, you know, they went to all these millions of dollars of this report, they've made recommendations, but it appears to me anyway in Victoria nothing's changed. I'm not sure how it is in New South Wales. Hopefully there's a little bit better coordination up in New South Wales at the moment. And just to finish, just on another bandwagon of mine, and I think it's really important that this is a really important slide, because basically this is just going to get worse and worse and worse. The IPCC report from 2012 acknowledged that this is going to become a bigger problem in South East Australia as the years go on. So, sure, it's important for us to treat the situation as it happens, but I think we've all got a responsibility, a bigger responsibility, to do something to help prevent the worsening of this as the years go on, through obvious means. Thank you.